We'll see where it puts it. Hi, Amy.
Hi.
It's funny calling you Amy because I'm used to
I know, right?
what's up. I'm so glad that you are up for having this conversation about trauma
Sure.
because I know I don't have a lot of education in this world, this arena. So I am really interested to hear like what is trauma and how does trauma present itself?
Sure.
And I think a lot of times as family caregivers, the experience that we're going through is actually pretty freaking traumatic.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a lot of trauma from our past that
Hmm.
resurfaces
Sure.
as we are in a caregiver role. And like I had a senior who was at my rehab facility and she had a broken hip and had had surgery. And what actually kept coming up during her, and she's in her 70s, her rehab
Uh-huh.
stay was the abuse that she had sustained from both of her parents in her childhood.
Mm.
And so it made, I'm being ginger with my language because I want to be aware and sensitive and I'm open to being educated, but I felt so deeply sad for her because she was so wounded.
Yeah.
And here she's also aging and
Hmm.
trying to recover from this other traumatic thing. So anyway,
Absolutely.
so starting at the beginning, what
Well,
is trauma? Like
I think
how is it
I think
defined?
that probably the most basic definition of it is just when something is happening to you that threatens you in some capacity. So that can be very vague and wide open.
Yeah.
And you don't feel a sense of control to stop it. And so there really needs to be both of those components, that you do feel a sense of threat.
Hmm.
Um, and and from what we understand now, from just our understanding of the brain and how it works, we understand that when a traumatic event happens, there's this entire it sets it sets into motion this chain reaction chemically in our body, and that chemical reaction is kind of what ends up defining whether or not something is traumatic or not for us. And so um, you and I can have the exact same experience, and for whatever reason, you may feel more threatened. And so
Mm.
you may have a different response physiologically in your body. And that information then gets stored as trauma. Where for me, maybe I may not experience that way. I may not feel that sense of threat, that sense of urgency. I don't have that chemical chain reaction, which involves adrenaline and cortisone and all different kinds of chemicals in your body. And so my body doesn't store it, my brain doesn't store it as a traumatic event. Um, the other thing we understand is that sometimes it's called big T or little t. We can
Okay.
have really significant traumatic events like, you know, being mugged or something, being in a horrific accident, or we can have a series of small little traumatic events um, that accumulatively are actually more difficult to resolve and to feel safety in the present. So there's lots of different things, and then there's like just this complex and chronic trauma, which
Mm.
happens in you know children who are abused throughout their childhood, women and men who experience domestic violence for years, where you just live in a constant state of threat. People who grow up in war torn countries, even people, we're starting to really understand medical trauma. And so people who have lived their entire life with illness and have spent, are in and out having surgeries constantly, and just what that means, that sense of, am I ever going to feel better? Am I ever going to be better? That's a threat to ourselves. And so I think we're starting to understand that there's a great deal of complexity to trauma. There's not one thing. We don't necessarily have to define it as a Vietnam vet anymore. It's,
Mm.
we have a
Yeah.
much more expansive understanding of it.
I mean, I have a friend who says we're all just walking wounded.
Yeah.
And the older I get, the more I have this sense of undercurrent that most of us at some point have had some level of trauma. You talk about big T and little t and complex and
Hmm.
chronic. And I mean, are any of us getting through this unscathed? I don't
Well,
know.
and I think something that's, collectively, I think how you responded to the threat of COVID is something where, like, collectively worldwide, there
Mhm.
was a sense of immediate threat, especially when I know here in Omaha that it seemed like it could be threatening at any moment. We could be under siege like New York City, and
Right.
and then there were people who were just sort of casual about it. But if you were somebody who really worried about it, who took precautions, who were really scared about what that meant for loved ones, that may be a collective trauma that we all experience, children, everybody, so I think there's truth to that. Are you familiar with the ACEs study?
No.
Okay, so this is where a lot of trauma research came from, but I'm not sure which insurance company really started to look at. There were some connections between people who had similar health conditions, diabetes, had blood pressure, even certain kinds of cancers. They started to look at what are some risk factors that are not related to health, outside risk factors. And this resulted in, I think it was a 15-year study called the ACE study,
Hmm.
where they came up with 15 sort of traumatic things that people live through or have experienced. And the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have these wounds, and the more likely there's a physical impact on your body, on your well-being. And even the number, the higher your ACE score, the more the shorter your lifespan is, which is
Wow.
incredible. Like, that's how much it affects us. And so this research started a chain reaction of really understanding trauma a little bit better and its impact on the body and how and why, so that we can start looking at how to reverse it. And there is a lot more research that's starting to come out, but it's
Mhm.
still very much in its infancy, about what are what are some of the what are things that we can put in place to reverse it? We can't
Mhm.
change the fact that maybe we lived in a very dangerous neighborhood growing up. We can't change that. What can we do to keep ourselves healthy and reverse some of that stuff? So
That's
that's really
amazing.
exciting. And there are some things that are clear resiliency factors. And one of the biggest resiliency factors we have are relationships with others and
Okay.
having connection with others, which is why, you know, um, being a caregiver for somebody can can be life changing, because that caregiver is the connection, and that's our biggest resiliency factor.
So is it the ACE? ACE?
ACE. Hmm.
Okay.
If you Google it, you will find more information than you ever want. But the really cool thing is to take it yourself,
Yeah.
because then you have a sense of your own ACE score. And um, a lot of trauma informed care is now looking not at what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you, what have been your life experiences that get you to the place that you're at right now, because it's a much better understanding, it's a much more complex understanding of how people show up is related to all that other stuff that they're walking around with every day.
Yeah. No, and I
Yeah.
think that language that you just used, how people show up, like here we are operating within our families, operating within workforces. We have people in government and leadership, but like everybody has a background and a childhood and potentially these different levels of trauma. The two things that are coming up for me right now are how can trauma manifest in ourselves? Like, how
Hmm.
does it present? And then I'm thinking about like a trauma scale. You said in some people, something would maybe not induce that chemical reaction,
Mm-hmm.
where in another person it might.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the, I don't know if concern is the right word, but I think areas of conflict is where we judge other people's trauma and say,
Yeah.
well, that wasn't that bad.
Right. Right.
And so then now we're in this like judgment shame cycle, and it's really confusing as a person who has experienced something as perceived as trauma. So, okay, let's start with just how does it show up? Like what are things that would maybe be happening in our bodies or our lives that could
Yeah.
be
So
something from trauma?
I think one of the coolest explanations I have ever heard of trauma and how it's stored in your brain is kind of this idea that most of our memories are stored in our brains, in a part of our brains where we understand them from start to finish. So there's a linear pattern to them, there's a story.
Okay.
Um, and we can think about, our first day of kindergarten or something, and we can think about all these different details and we have all these pieces, but we can tell it as a story. Sometimes trauma gets stored in our brain in a way that we can tell the linear story. But anytime that chemical reaction happens in our body, where we feel that intense stuff, part of our survival mechanism kicks in, and we start to store pieces of it all split up. And the best description I've heard of it is it's like a viewfinder, like those old school. Do
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
you like put the little button down and
Yes.
the
And
thing
so it's
shifts.
not really a story. If you take all the pieces apart, you don't understand it. They're just all one little file. And that's how our brain stores it, as all these tiny little files. So tiny little pieces without a start, middle, and end. And the problem with that is that anytime we see something or smell something or sense something that is similar to one of those tiny little files, our bodies can go, here we go again. We
Oh.
need to prepare. We need to get ready to go or save ourselves. And so flight, fight, or freeze kick in because we feel like we're there again. And so those are called trauma triggers. And we may not even understand why we're experiencing it. We may not know. We may not have any memory of a smell or a color or, the feeling of a plastic bag, or, it can be this really, really benign stuff that we experience every day. And we can't make sense of it. But all of a sudden we may experience, sometimes it's just our heart beating fast and we don't understand why. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes it's, anger. It can come
Mhm.
out as anger, frustration, and there's no explanation for it. But usually there's a physiological response. There's something that happens, sweaty, palms sweating, some kind of response that says we are in flight, fight, or freeze. And for some people, that means we just shut down completely. I think we all understand this idea of, I keep pulling back to vets because I think that's how we first
Mhm.
learned about trauma, most of us. And so we think of, hearing fireworks and crawling under the table. That's that shutting down stuff. Extreme and an extreme response to it is what we call disassociation, which is we just go away and
Mhm.
mentally we leave our bodies. And that's just, it's very instinctual. It is how we saved ourselves. It's how we are continuing to walk on this earth when we've lived through traumatic events, because
Mhm.
we're all survivors, and our bodies have figured out how to make us survive. But it doesn't always work well with relationships. And so a lot of times that's when people have experienced a great deal of trauma, then their substance use, to make it stop.
Yes.
We see people who really isolate, have extreme anxiety, and sometimes those are kind of extreme manifestations of it. Difficulty in relationships, difficulty maintaining relationships, because maybe we are, very excited or not excited at all. And so that's hard for other people to connect with us. And so we may see people who are hyper vigilant and they're just always on edge all the time.
Right.
But then we can also see people who are blunted and nothing seems to get them riled up. And so their sort of zone of tolerance is really different than someone who maybe isn't dealing with that every day.
So when you were describing the physical visceral reaction that maybe somebody has when they're triggered, like
Yeah.
that sounds so much like a panic attack or
Yes.
anxiety
Yeah.
attack. And I really believe in people taking care of themselves and their mental
Mhm.
health and
Yeah.
seeking medical attention when they need it.
Yeah.
I feel like almost everybody I know is either on an antidepressant or on some sort of anti-anxiety medication.
Yes. Yeah.
And obviously, mentioning COVID, like we all just lived through this really traumatic world event. Is
Mhm.
there a way to navigate the trauma without a medication? I think in those cases when it's warranted, it's so
Yeah.
critically important because otherwise we can't function.
Yes.
But is there a way to take advantage of neuroplasticity or a
Mhm.
retraining of our brain?
Yes, yes. All of
Yeah.
those. I mean, I think there's great value in starting to really connect that those somatic responses, all of those physical responses, to start to recognize that they're happening and
Mhm.
become aware of them, and making you can make an active choice early on
Mhm.
when you're starting to experience that. You can start to do grounding and do some different activities to basically reset yourself and say, hey, listen, I'm not there anymore, right? This traumatic event isn't happening. Sometimes physical grounding is the best way to remind our body that we aren't back where that really scary thing happened. So
Right.
we don't need to be fearful. And EMDR is a therapy that that is has been used for probably about 15 years, I think. Um, that is super highly effective in in addressing some of this stuff. So it's a therapeutic approach that isn't uh, it's not medication.
Mhm.
And it basically what EMDR is it's not a talking therapy. It is a somatic therapy where we use eye movement and
Mhm.
a bilateral stimulation to help. This is really bizarre, but it helps bring our processing on board in such a way that we can process the event that happened, whatever it is, or the series of events or many events, very quickly. We can teach our brain to process it and put it in a space-time continuum so
Okay.
that it doesn't take the memory away. It's not hypnosis, but what it does is it helps us to understand that this is a bad thing that happened to us, but then our body doesn't need to respond to it anymore. Because even if we have a trigger of it, even if I smell a smell that brings me back there, it may bring me back there and I can think, wow, that was a really awful thing that happened to me,
Mhm.
but I don't think it's still happening to me. And so it helps the brain and body understand that I'm not still stuck there. It kind of pulls you out of that. So that's a really that I mean that is right now the most effective treatment for
Okay.
addressing trauma. But I think there are lots of things that people can do. I think self-care and there's so much about mindfulness right now.
Mhm.
And I think it's because we do understand that slowing down and paying attention to one thing at one time, it helps our brains slow down, and we can pay attention to what's happening in the here and now, and that grounds us. That
Okay.
that keeps us grounded all the time, which is hard to do if you're a caregiver because you
It
feel like you probably have to do 100 things at once,
right.
and it's hard to take time to ground and to take care of yourself. But that's the other piece of it. We have to take care of ourselves because otherwise we're of no use to anybody.
I mean, you cannot give what you don't have. And if you are at
Absolutely.
capacity and your bandwidth
Yes.
is shot and you're trying to juggle however
Mhm.
many things, a lot of people in a caregiver role are also caring for young children or a partner.
Mhm.
as well. When you talk about grounding, like two things are coming to mind. I didn't know if you could just elaborate on that. Like I've
Sure.
heard of earthing. Is that what we're talking about? Or is it like
So
there's a
yeah,
lamp, there's a pencil there?
yeah. There are various ways to do grounding, and so there is kind of this physical grounding you can do, which is probably more of what you're talking about with earthing. It's like really paying attention to the fact that there's a chair underneath me,
Mhm.
really making sure I can solidly feel my feet on the floor, maybe touching things around me, grabbing onto my chair, so I can physically feel a space underneath me. I'm not floating in space and time. I'm here in this room right now.
Mhm.
Um, a really quick way to do that is to look at the four corners of the room. So you just like stop and you acknowledge that there are four corners in the space you are. Or you can, another really nice, easy way to ground is to look at your hands and just pay attention for a couple of seconds to your hands. You recognize that your hands are your present hands. You have that paper cut on there that you did, that you got yesterday. It's not your hands from 20 years ago. Those are your
Mhm.
most beautiful present aged hands. And that's a nice way to do some of that physical grounding. Then there's mental grounding, and mental grounding is just I am going to stop my brain by thinking of something that I don't necessarily think of. So counting, it
Mhm.
kind of pulls your brain into a very rational space. It takes higher level thinking. And so it's hard to function on that emotional level. You're basically saying, I'm pulling my brain from downstairs to upstairs, and I'm
Okay.
going to do that higher level thinking. So spelling, writing is a good one. Anything that requires multiple steps, and not that you have to do the multiple steps, but you know, how do I make macaroni and cheese? Let me just go through what are the steps I need to do. And sometimes when we are really, really in an emotional state and we are really overwhelmed or we are really trauma triggered, coming up with something is hard to pull us out of that. And so physical grounding is the fastest way to get us back there. But we
Mm.
can get physically grounded by doing really simple things like feeling the ground underneath us, looking at the four corners of the room. And once we start doing that, then add in something like start counting something in the room. How many blue things are in the room? How do I spell my kids' names backwards? Whatever is your go-to. And you can have one or two that you always go to, but your brain can't function in two places at once. So when you start making your brain do that really physical or that real mental workout of counting or categorizing, it takes you out of that emotional space in your brain, and you can just then slow down.
Because we're having all these thoughts coming at us, but like really we can only think one at a time.
Right.
So it
Right.
sounds like that's helping us get refocused on
Yep.
something other than
Yep.
the traumatic thought. So that can help us like settle down in the moment when we're having that
Yes.
visceral reaction. Like what keeps coming up for me as we're having this conversation is being in the hospital room and waiting for a doctor to come in to
Yes.
like give us a diagnosis or a
Oh,
prognosis of
yeah.
where things are
Yeah.
heading and like what needs to happen next.
So those are good things. The other thing is a couple of things that I really like to do. These are like it's kind of like when you hit control delete on your computer and kind of reset the system. So there
Mhm.
are ways that we can reset our own system when these are resets for your nervous system. So when you're feeling like intense anxiety, you can anything bilateral will kind of start helping that. So rocking, there's a reason why we rock babies.
Mhm.
And sometimes when we rock babies, it's very soothing for us as well. But either forward, backward, or side to side. So if you can sway side to
Okay.
side or kind of move your feet from side to side. If sometimes people don't like to do really physical things when other people are watching. So if you're uncomfortable resetting yourself in front of somebody else, even just tapping on either side of your leg. So if you were to be sitting in a chair and you just
Mhm.
put your hands very casually on your thighs, you can go left, right, left, right, left, right. And that bilateral stimulation helps calm the brain.
Wow.
And yeah, another a really good reset that I like is it's like a bear hug. And I don't know if you can see me. Hopefully you can. You kind of take one hand and put it under your armpit right here. And
Okay.
you take the other hand and you just kind of give yourself a really tight squeeze. And as you do that, I'm going to keep talking. But
Yeah.
as you do it, you just kind of feel it. And it's helpful if you feel safe enough to close your eyes and just sort of feel that hug and don't think about it, just feel it. And usually what happens is within about a minute, your body will let out a sigh, like it's involuntary.
Mm.
There will be a sigh. You may feel yourself yawn,
Shoulders. Mhm.
and that's the reset. And when you hit that point, you have reset your nervous system, which is really cool that we have the ability to do that. So yeah, you just kind of sit there like that and give yourself a really big squeeze
That's amazing.
and pay attention to your breath. And it's really cool when you do it. Like I would recommend that you do that with a little bit of peace the first time. And you will really, when you feel that yawn come on, it's kind of this cool thing like, wow, I'm magic. I can do this to myself.
It's like
And then another,
self-soothing.
it is soothing, isn't it? We
Yeah.
don't hug ourselves enough. Um, and then the other thing we can do is it's another reset like this. And they're really basic, but this one you kind of relax your shoulders and you move your neck, you look one side,
Mm-hmm.
and then you kind of twist to the other side, and then you find a neutral and you look down. You don't move your face, but move your eyes and look down to one side, it doesn't matter. And you just kind of hold that gaze for, probably 30 seconds. You don't have to count it. And then go back to just like a normal straight gaze, and then go back down to the opposite side and do that for about 30 seconds. Same thing will happen. Your body will usually let out a sigh or a yawn, which means that your reset is done. And then a nice way to close out is just to kind of do the twist again.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times when you do that, you will have a greater range of motion and you'll feel like kind of a difference in your shoulders, which is really cool because that's where a lot of people hold that is right here, kind of in that part of your body. So those are just like really basic resets that you can do all the time.
Those are amazing. And like you can do a lot of those things, like you said, super subtly. So even standing in line at the grocery store,
Right.
it may
Right.
appear like you're crossing your arms, but really,
Yeah, you can just be like, I'm really frustrated.
yeah.
Yeah, and just sit there like that, or I'm cold or whatever. But
Mhm.
and then, when you have space and time away, which probably is hard when you're a caregiver, but another really, really cool way to reset your body is called TRE.
Mhm.
And you can look this up. There are bazillion YouTube videos that walk you through TRE,
Mhm.
but it is a practice of it's a practice of bringing about vibration in the body to
Mhm.
release trauma that's stored in the body. And it's a really quite amazing. It's a longer term. It takes about 20 minutes to do it. But it just involves, there's nothing tricky about it. It's just a matter of you do kind of quick fatigue of the muscles in
Mhm.
your legs. And then if you watch the video, it'll walk you through it. But Dr. Berselli is who is kind of behind TRE,
Mhm.
and it's really quite effective during the height of 9/11. A lot of the first responders started using TRE at the end of shifts, and there are still police houses or precincts in New York City that end every shift with TRE
Oh
because
my
it's so
God.
good to just let go of all that stuff and before you go home.
Yeah.
And a lot of trauma therapists use TRE so that they're not taking on secondary trauma, which is what would happen for a caregiver, right?
Right.
You are assuming a great deal of secondary trauma just by bearing witness. And so that medical trauma, even though it's not happening to you, in a lot of ways, if you're a familial caregiver, it is happening to you, but then you're also you're also experiencing primary and secondary trauma as a result of it. And so that is really hard on your body and just your mental capacity and just,
Mhm.
there's so many implications of that. And so finding ways to take care of yourself in a meaningful way is really important, and to discharge some of that out of your body.
Well, yeah, you cannot keep adding on, adding on, adding on. You see those videos about how heavy is this glass of water, and or how much is put in this glass, but how heavy is this glass of water? Well, the weight doesn't change, but how long you hold it
Yes.
impacts
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
weight
Yeah.
and your ability
Hmm.
to hold it.
Yeah. And I think there's like a third layer of complexity if it's a caregiver who maybe you didn't have this wonderful childhood and now you are caring for somebody. So you're experiencing all of that in the present while it's triggering all this stuff from the past, or, just anything that's unresolved. It doesn't even have to be um, that you were necessarily abused, but just anything that's unresolved. It would just be bringing that up on a daily basis. And that's just, it's hard to just carry that all the time.
Right. And I think
Yeah.
just feeling seen and
Mhm.
validated in that is
Yeah.
a first phase for people that
Yeah.
caregiving is hard enough as it is. But from
Hmm.
the outside, not everybody knows our pasts
Yeah.
or our history
Right.
with the people that we're taking care of. So I think
Right.
it's again like going back to easing up on judgment of other people,
Right.
of thinking what people should and shouldn't be doing for their
Yeah.
family members. Like you have no idea
Right. Right.
what someone is carrying with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, this is really amazing. So it feels like there is hope that we can reset our
Yeah.
thought processes and be on the other side
Hmm.
of trauma.
Most, yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And for people that are really just like, I'm just up against it and this isn't working. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, what should they be looking for on the internet as resources? You mentioned the TRE, the ACE score,
Hmm.
HDMR,
EM. E
H-
E EMDR.
EMDR. I'm
Uh-huh.
thinking HDMI. Don't look up HDMI. You'll be full of tech stuff. Um,
Right.
I think these are amazing resources for people to check into. And what's coming up right now is, well, I'm stuck in this situation. I'm going to do this to get through each moment, but I'm starting to lose hope,
Yeah.
you know. And I really believe there's always hope. There are resources in the community that
Oh,
people
absolutely.
can.
We are, I think, in Omaha, I think we are very fortunate because there are some trauma therapists who are not just incredible practitioners, but I think they have made it a mission to ensure that many therapists in this community are trauma informed
Mm,
and are beginning to be trained to address trauma in a really meaningful way. And so, by holding the trainings themselves, I mean, they have become sort of gurus in their own right. And so I think there are a lot of trauma specific therapists. And I think that, so there's a lot of resources in this community, but I think in general across the country, I think we are just becoming far more aware of trauma. And
mhm.
I think that insurance companies, are starting to realize that we need to take care of people mentally because it affects them physically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think that insurance companies are starting to catch on that we need to provide mental health care. And so I think a lot more insurance companies are making that a possibility. But even for people who aren't insured, there are a lot of sliding scale fee programs. I know I work for Heartland Family Service,
Mhm.
and we do if you're not eligible for insurance, we do sliding scale. And there are a
Okay.
lot of agencies in the area that provide care, mental health care for anyone.
Well, and I'm thinking for people that work for a company, there are a lot of EAP
Yeah,
programs, employee
yeah,
assistance programs, and I don't know if those are being utilized to their full extent.
absolutely not. And most EAPs have it set up. I mean, it's almost standard now that you have five sessions of therapy before it even becomes I think they can do up to five is pretty
Mhm.
standard. And for some people, five is enough to give you some skills. Some people don't need, I think there's also this notion, the really cool thing about EMDR therapy is it's super, super fast. And
Mm,
so people can get in, they can do therapy for 6 months and be, really feel like they have nothing plaguing them like they did when they walked in the door. It's not like these years and years of laying on the couch, like psychotherapy used to really,
right.
talk therapy. It doesn't, it's not like that. It's far more, it, it it's really focused on being brief interventions. So I think that also helps. And when you feel like you have no time, I think the other piece of this is COVID. The one positive thing about COVID is we were talking about this, everybody does Zoom now. There are a lot of therapy resources that are via Zoom. So even if you can't get away, if you're
Yeah.
really housebound because you're with somebody who really can't be left alone, if you can go find a private space for 45 minutes, you can get a therapy session in. And I think that's a really cool option.
Even if it means your closet floor or a
It
bathroom
absolutely
or
bathroom.
I believe therapists are starting to become like you can find somebody at any time, really day or night because
Yeah.
of time zones and technology. So
Yes, this is true. And I know that BetterHelp, and there's several online ones that are, like you said, you may have a therapist from anywhere in the country. And for some people that feels really safe too,
mm,
to not be face to face, to not have it be somebody who they may run into at church or at the grocery store, to have it have this real sense of anonymity. Some people aren't ready to have it be anything but that.
right.
So there's lots of options. Hmm.
I think this has given me a renewed sense of hope that
Oh, good.
one, I mean, it's nice to know you're not alone.
Yeah.
Everybody is dealing with something and
Mhm.
knowing that maybe what I'm experiencing that feels really severe is validated
Yep. Yeah.
and that
And
there's go ahead.
I think that that brings up a really important part because I was talking about connection before and that being
Mhm.
resiliency. I think the other thing people can do when they are involved in anything that really, you have to build up your connections and
Mhm.
you need support of people who are in a similar situation
Right.
so that you can just go, oh, this is where I'm at. And there isn't judgment and there isn't, it's just like somebody who can say, yeah, I've been there too. I've
Mhm.
felt that way before. It's okay to feel that way. It's validating. It makes us feel like we're human. We don't start to question that kind of really basic thinking. We don't start to deal with shame on top of everything else because we're feeling a certain way. That piece of connecting with other people who are either, providing caregiving or have done it at one time,
Mhm.
I think there's a ton of value to that. And there's a shorthand, right? You don't have to go into all the details. You can just say, oh wow, mom was really tough today, and
Mm,
that might be enough for somebody else to go, I know where that's at. I
right.
think there's so much value in that. And I think when we talk about it, it doesn't get stored in the same place. It doesn't get like stuffed and buried, and then something we have to deal with on our own. And I think sometimes when we're balancing so much and juggling so much, um, we get stuck in this idea that we have to be subhuman, that we have to
Mm,
be super, and we have to be able to manage all this. And somehow by reaching out to anybody else, it's admitting that we're not quite as superhuman as we think we are. And when there's a lot of people counting on you, it's hard for you to think that maybe you're not. So if you are caring for children and a parent and a spouse and all those people, you have to be able to reach out to somebody else that, has no skin in the game. It can't be somebody from inside. It needs to be somebody from outside that can just be like, yeah, I hear you. Hmm.
yes. See you, hold space for you.
Yes.
Caregiving is so isolating. And
Hmm.
so many people, I mean, it feels like everybody that I know again is going through this in some level, and they're looking around like, am I the only one? It feels like I'm the only one, but nobody's really
Yeah.
talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How and isolation, I mean, there are studies that show isolation has health impacts like 6 alcoholic beverages a day and 15 cigarettes being smoked. Like there are some significant of loneliness.
Yeah. Because we are wired for connection. We need it. And so when we don't have it, we are, we are missing a vital piece of what we need to survive.
Mhm.
Yeah. I just think that's so valuable. Podcasts like this, where people can just hear other people talk, I think. But even if even if getting together is not real, Zoom calls or whatever you can do where you have somebody that you can just reach out to that just understands where you're at.
Yeah.
More
So
than,
so helpful, so powerful.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
thank you. This has been a lot of information. I'm going to go back through and grab bits and pieces so that,
Good.
yeah, I can put a lot in the show notes. So if people are looking, you work for a specific organization and don't
Yes.
take on board new clients. If someone's looking for someone in their local community to help them, what would they search up trauma therapist or what should they
Yeah.
be looking
I
for?
think that would be a really good starting point. Um, and if specifically they could look up EMDR and find out more about that, and then look up therapists that are actually trained. EMDR requires it's a specialization.
Okay.
And the cool thing about EMDR is that it also requires ongoing consultation the entire time you're doing it. So as an EMDR therapist, for me to maintain that, um, I have to have consultation once a month with other therapists who are also doing it, which is cool, right? Because then
Yeah.
we also get to have that support network. But it's just, or anybody who's doing any kind of work with trauma, there's so many great things that can be done with it. But um, if you just look up trauma therapy, you should be able to find somebody pretty quickly.
Well, this is amazing. Thank you for sharing your expertise today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so grateful. And I will see you at 5 a.m. in a parking lot somewhere to work out sometime.
All right, sounds good.
All right, take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.